morning, everyone. I believe it's already past 10, so we're going to get this started. Welcome to the July EFPC market call. I have to be honest, after last month, I didn't think I could get more excited about our speaker. We had Paul Donovan joining us, for those of you who attended, you can remember. So he just basically is the chief economist at UBS, and he essentially shared his views around monetary policy and how he believes that the US central bank specifically is way overdue in terms of cutting interest rates. So we heard their monetary decision yesterday night where they decided to keep interest rates on hold, with some hints that they might possibly cut it at their next sitting, but we will have to wait and see if that materializes. So today we are privileged to have Mr. Kuben Naidoo join us. He's known in most circles, so I don't think I will be able to do your reputation justice by doing the introduction, but I will try my best. Mr. Kuben served at the Treasury for a very long period of time, for 18 years, if I'm not mistaken. Thereafter, he headed to the central bank, where he occupied the position of the deputy governor, worked under John Marcus as well as Lesecha, which is extremely amazing. So he's a well-respected individual with a lot of knowledge with regards to monetary policy. And more recently, Mr. Kuben Naidoo joined Investec in an executive position where he will be responsible essentially for building up their payments business. So we wish you all the best on your new journey, but we know it's going to be a rewarding one for you. He also holds an MBA from the University of Birmingham. It's going to be a very informative discussion. Mr. Dawie Roodt is going to host Mr. Kuben Naidoo. I don't think Dawie needs any introduction amongst us, as well as most South Africans. I'm also going to try there. But before we get started, let's just deal with a few house rules. So we've recently started to host these market calls in person again. We've received some very nice feedback, so we plan on continuing this trend going forward. But for everybody that's online, if you're ever in Gauteng or in the Pretoria area, please pop in. We'll make sure that there's some snacks and beverages for you as well. I think there is going to be one in Cape Town later this year, and we are planning for a few in other areas, but that will take time as well. So we're very excited about that. Secondly, thank you for everybody here today. So on your tables, you'll see this small leaflet. It's a black leaflet. There's a few questions on there. Please fill it out. Please remember to write your name at the back. There's not a space for your name at the front, so just do it at the back. Afterwards, we're going to have a little bit of a draw, and you have the opportunity of winning a 500 Rand Take a Lot gift voucher. So excited about that. Chris is definitely excited. Yes, and then there's going to be a Q&A session after the discussion. So please feel free, everybody online, to post your questions in the chat box. For those who aren't comfortable doing that, send those questions to Eunice, myself, or Chantal, and we'll deal with that afterwards as well. And then, for everybody here, there's some refreshments and food afterwards. So thank you for joining us. Over to you, James.
Thanks. Dankie Renier, dankie goeiemôre aan almal. Thank you very much for joining us.
Dankie Dawie.
Dis lekker om jou hier te hê vanoggend.
Dis my plesier. Dankie.
Very nice, congratulations with your new job at Investec. We're going to talk about that a little bit. So the topic this morning is about money, and it's about banking, and that's really one of my favorite topics, especially the money part. And of course, as an economist, money is very important. But I think, maybe I should start off and kick off by just giving my view of a short history of money, where money came from, and then you can follow up a couple of, there's going to be a lot of blanks in there. But I would say, if you go through the history of mankind, that one of the greatest economic discoveries, one of the greatest economic breakthroughs, was the discovery of money. I think money really changed the world in which we're living. And in fact, money keeps on changing the world that we're living in. Maybe a good place to start is going back, say, maybe 20,000 years or so, when the concept of private property rights was first established, when we started domesticating animals, for example. So first there was this concept of private property rights, and only after that we started trading with one another. And the typical trade was in a form of barter trade, which basically meant that the buyer and the seller gained from a transaction, because otherwise the transaction would not have happened. But there's a big problem with barter trade. If I want to exchange my one sheep for a chicken, then I'm going to get 10 chickens for my sheep, and I only wanted one chicken. So that is a bit of a dilemma, because now I've got 9 chickens I don't want. And so it was an amazing breakthrough to discover this thing that we call money, and we could use money, exchange my sheep for a piece of money, whatever form of money, and make use of a small part of my money to buy a chicken, for example. Now I've got my chicken and some money. So I could, and money at that stage already fulfilled a number of functions. One is it's easier to trade, for example, but another one's a saving function. I could put my money apart or aside, and I can use it tomorrow or the day thereafter. Gradually over time, money started changing its form. Initially, it was barter trading, and then it turned into something in between, and eventually we settled on precious metals, like, for example, gold, and that became money for a long time. Money eventually gold was in the form of precious metals, was in the form of coins, and there's a term called signorage, and that's how central banks make their money, because the king had the right to put his face on the coin, and there was legislation. He forced people to only use the money that with his face on it, and in the process he would put a little bit of lead into the gold or chip some of the gold off, and that's how he made his money, the king. And gradually money evolved into paper money, because people started taking their gold and put it to the goldsmiths, and the goldsmith will give him a piece of paper called an IOU, and that was the beginning of paper money. And paper money lasted for a long time. Unfortunately, paper money was not very stable, because people realized that the goldsmiths were issuing more IOUs than the actual gold that they had in the vaults. And there was a run on a bank. That was the first run on a bank. And then that's the reason why we have certain reserve requirements on banks today. They have to have some money, actual money, in reserve. So if people want to come and withdraw their money, the money is actually there. And then from paper money, money evolved into electronic money. And that is where we are today, mostly electronic money. Initially, electronic money and normal paper money was backed by gold, the so-called gold standard. 1971, Richard Nixon decided, no, we're going to step off the gold standard. And from then onwards, most central banks had money, electronic form of money, and money that they could create literally out of nothing. And that's where we are today. We've got so-called fiat money. The word fiat means let there be, like out of nothing. So that's what central banks do today. They create money literally out of nothing. It's called fiat money, and there's no limitation on how much money banks, and basically the whole credit process, how much money can be created. And central banks today, they've got a very important responsibility. In the case of South Africa, for example, they have to make sure that not too much electronic money is created, because if you create too much money, that will lead to inflation, and that's why we have inflation targets in South Africa. And the most recent form of money, and we're going to debate about that a little bit, is another kind of money that is making its appearance the past 10 years or so, and it's called Bitcoin, or the blockchain based, and that's a private kind of money. It's also money that's created out of nothing, and I would argue it's not really much of a difference from fiat money, private money, but what also happening is that central banks are creating central bank digital money, or central bank digital currencies. And there are a number of central banks that already are experimenting with central bank digital currencies, and I think that is going to be one of those big new inventions that's going to change the world of money. Just a comment, as you see how money evolved over time, whenever there's a move into a new kind of money, a new financial instrument, that led to this explosion of economic activity. And I would argue money every time contributed to this growth in economies as well. And of course, banks play a very important role in this whole thing about money. Banks will take deposits from depositors. They are financial intermediaries, and they will lend the money out to lenders to buy a house or whatever the case may be, and they will keep some money in reserve. In the meantime, the central bank keeps on creating money out of nothing, so-called base money, and they increase the price of money or reduce the price of money called interest rates in order to make sure that inflation maintain or remain within a certain band, 3 to 6% in the case of South Africa. Now, there's a short summary of money. But I'm sure I left out a lot of gaps there. Maybe you can fill in.
No, that's an incredibly accurate summary of money from my understanding as well. Let me start by just agreeing on your broad story. The point that you made is that there is a relationship between the money supply and prices, right? So if the money supply goes up too fast, then prices go up, right? And that has been a problem with money since the day dot.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, long before paper money, people used metals. Gold was one of the few things that kept its store for a long time, because you can't just make gold, right? But cowrie shells were used as money, right? People used sort of sticks with slits as money. But it's possible to make those things, right? It's far harder to make gold. You can mine it, but certainly far harder to make gold. And so any monetary system must have a way of managing how much you can create of it. Because if you don't, the collapse of that money would, the value of that money would collapse. Right? And I think we both agree on that point.
Yeah.
Right? And so modern monetary systems not only have the ability to create money out of thin air, but also have the ability to maintain the value of that money. If we can't maintain the value of the money, in fact, in South Africa, the wording in the constitution is to protect the value of the currency in the interests of balanced and sustainable growth. They don't mean currency as in relation to rands or dollars or pounds, but the value of the currency, the rand. To protect the value of the currency in the interest of sustainable growth and development. So if your rand can buy a loaf of bread today, then it should be able to buy very close to a loaf of bread next year and the following year. Right? Now, there is a long history of privately issued money in the world. Right? In fact, in South Africa, prior to 1921, all the banks issued their own currency. So you had Standard Bank money, Volkskas money, Nedbank money. In the US, you had privately issued money as well. And in the US, so the fashion started to change in the US. So in the US had a major banking crisis in 1888, where if I've got JP Morgan money and you've got Morgan Stanley money and you've got sort of Goldman Sachs money, let's say, if I think your bank is safer, then I want your money, I don't want my money. Right? So I run to my bank to change the money. And you had lots of bank runs. You had quite a lot of instability in the banking system. So 1888, the US had a major banking crisis. 1906, the US had a major banking crisis. And then after the First World War, it was the US that first decided, hang on a minute, this doesn't work. This idea of privately issued currencies doesn't work. We're going to create the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is going to get a monopoly on the production of currency. Now, the Bank of England is 350 years old, but the Bank of England was set up to help the king finance the Napoleonic Wars. Right? So the Bank of England was mainly a bank. It borrowed money from wealthy individuals, it issued pieces of paper in return, and it gave the money to the government to fight the Napoleonic Wars. The Bank of England only acquired the ability to print money in 1921, that same kind of period, right? Exactly the same year the SARB was formed, in 1921. The Swedish Riksbank is one of the oldest central banks in the world. And again, you had privately issued money. So the point I'm making is that, I don't have a principal objection to privately issued money, but privately issued money did cause a huge degree of instability in the world in the 1800s and early 1900s. And actually giving a central bank the monopoly to produce money for a long period provided a fairly high degree of stability. I mean, we've had financial crises, we've had hyperinflation during those periods. But in general, we've had quite a lot of stability when you gave a monopoly to an accountable institution to be able to produce those notes and coins. I do worry that if the world has to go back to an environment where you have privately issued currency, for a while it might work, but what controls the ability for you to produce more and more, right? And what controls the ability for me to say, that digital money or that privately issued money is more valuable than that one. I want to go to that one today. So I don't think that those are problems that the world has solved yet. But let me also say that you're absolutely right. 1971 to today is 53 years. Fiat money has only been in existence for 53 years, whereas money has been in existence for thousands of years. Yeah. So the form of money may change. The form of money may evolve. I'm not sure if having private issued money is necessarily a step forward and is necessarily a contributor to global economic stability.
Mm-hmm. Now, we can talk about that because I wanted to discuss things like, for example, Bitcoin a little bit later. But let's just understand this process of money creation and it's where the central bank fits in, or where banks fit in, all that. So a bank, and correct me here, but essentially the central bank will produce electronic money of say 100 rand, and they will credit the account of a bank at the central bank, at a South African Reserve Bank, and the bank will give to the central bank in return a piece of paper that is, say for example, a government bond. And then the bank will take this 100 rands, electronic money, and lend it out to somebody, and somebody else will spend it and will redeposit it back. So that is the money creation process. Maybe we can just talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
First of all, the first 100 rand that the central bank puts into the system, created out of nothing. And secondly, from there on, what happens to that rand? How does it become more?
Sure. I think it's as you described, right? The central bank theoretically can create money out of absolutely nothing, right? And so we do this in two ways. The one is we print notes and coins, and we give that to the banks, and they give us electronic money, right? We in this case, swapping one money form for another. The second way is through bonds, right? Or through treasury bills, or through Reserve Bank paper, Reserve Bank debentures. Effectively, we do that every day. So we can create money. If the banks need the money, they come to us, they give us paper, we give them the money. They could do one of two things. They could lend it to Dawie, but let's say they left with some spare cash overnight. They have to deposit it back at the central bank, often at prime or repo -1. Right, so they're making a loss out of it.
Yeah.
So if they've come to take it from the central bank, and it's costing them money, if they don't use it, it costs them even more. And so they don't take too much. They don't take more than they can use. Overnight, we have a settlement system. So let's say all the EFTs went from Standard Bank to First Rand, right? Hypothetically. First Rand then, Standard Bank has to settle First Rand overnight. First Rand then has got spare cash. They're not allowed to keep that cash. They have to park it somewhere overnight. So they can buy government bonds, they can buy treasury bills, or they can come and deposit in the central bank. In that way, we destroy money, right? When they've come and deposited it at the central bank. For most of the SARB's history, we used to control inflation and interest rates through what was called a money market shortage system.
Yeah. Not like that anymore.
No. 2 years ago we changed. But let me first describe the money market shortage system. So every night there's the settlement process between the banks. The SARB would go and we would take money out of the system. We would typically take out about 55 billion rand a month, right? So we create an artificial shortage. So if Standard Bank has to pay FNB, Standard Bank is short. Standard Bank then has to come to borrow the money from us, and we would lend them the money at the repo rate. Right? We force the banking system to borrow money from the central bank, and we set the interest rate at which they can borrow that money. That then becomes the floor interest rate in the economy.
So the last rand is also always borrowed from the central bank.
Exactly. But the world, probably about 10 to 15 years ago, started moving away from these shortage systems to a money market surplus system. Now, I don't understand all the intricate details about why that shift occurred, but what we now have is we no longer have a shortage system. We now have a surplus system. So what we do is we create 100 billion rand, let's say, and we give it to the banks at the start of the day in proportion to their weight, right? So Standard Bank gets 20, whatever, ABSA gets 19, whatever the case is. They have to use that money during the day. If they are surplus cash at the end of the evening, they have to either lend it amongst themselves, if somebody's short, or they have to buy government bonds, or they have to come and deposit it at the central bank at repo -1, right? So the shift to a surplus system, it achieves the exact same objective, right? It's a way that we would force the price of money through the economy. It achieves the exact same system. A surplus system gives us certain other tools that we didn't have in the past. So if we wanted to buy reserves, if we wanted to, in a crisis, if you want to inject liquidity into the banking system, it's easier for us to do that. So about 2 years ago, we moved towards the surplus system.
Just a side comment. And you mentioned the South African Reserve Bank was created in 2021.
No,
1921. But the South African Reserve Bank is a bit of an odd thing out because it's belonged to private individuals. And by the way, I've got 200 shares in the South African Reserve Bank. Maybe there's a lot of talk about nationalizing the Reserve Bank. We can go back to banking just now. I just want to understand that a little bit better.
Sure.
Will it make a difference if the Reserve Bank is nationalized, for example?
My personal view is it'll make absolutely no difference. Right? The ownership of the bank doesn't matter at all. Maybe I should just explain how the central bank became, or how they led to have private shareholding. When the bank was created in 1921, the government had two problems. One is they had to capitalize the central bank, and they didn't have the money at the time. Right? The second problem they had is they had to compensate the banks for taking their right to produce currency away. Right? So Standard Bank would produce currency. They're not allowed to produce currency anymore. We had to compensate them for that. So for those two reasons, private individuals got shares. The banks in the main, but private individuals got shares in the bank. That's not uncommon for how central banks started globally. In fact, many central banks globally had private shareholders. However, after the Second World War, most of the world got rid of their private shareholders. And the reason is that after the Second World War, most central banks were bankrupt. Right? Most central banks were running large losses, particularly in Europe, but to the US as well. They were making hundreds of billions of dollars worth of losses, or Deutschmark worth of losses. You had hyperinflation in the US after the Second World War. And private individuals were not prepared to recapitalize the central bank. Right? So, if you own a private company and the private company is making large losses, either the shareholders put the money in or you get taken out, you get liquidated. Right? So effectively, the governments liquidated those banks. And the governments took out the private shareholders, the government put in the capital, and in the main, that's how private shareholders were gotten rid of. There were about 7 central banks in the world where that did not happen. Right. South Africa was one of them. The private shareholders were not taken out after the Second World War because it wasn't really relevant. We weren't producing currency after the Second World War. Right. We were reliant on the pound after the Second World War. It was only after 1961, when the rand was introduced, that we started to produce our own currency. So that just explains why the SARB has private shareholders. But they have private shareholders, but my understanding is that in law they are not owned by those private individuals. The Constitution and the law says that this is the central bank of the country. Right? And it fulfills the function of a central bank of the country. The shareholders, the dividend is capped at 10 cents a share. And that's in law, and that can't change. And that's been there since 91, 92.
Just by the way, my dividend that I get every now and again is approximately 8 rand.
Exactly. Right? So you can't make a profit out of the central bank. In a normal year, we'll make 2-3 billion rand profit, of which we pay a grand total of 200,000 rand to the shareholders. Right? The rest of the money goes back to government, either directly or indirectly. We pay tax, but the rest of the money goes back either as a form of a dividend or as a deferred dividend. Right? Everything goes back to government. Now, whether we take out those shareholders or not, it's going to make no difference to the functioning of the bank. Right? No difference. The functioning of the bank is set in law, it's in statute. What it would make a difference is that the board of the central bank, which plays no policy role but plays an important fiduciary role, 7 out of the 15 members of the board are elected by the private shareholders. So every year at the AGM, which was Tuesday, Monday.
Yeah, 2 days ago. Yeah.
Monday or Tuesday, Dawie would go with his 200 shares and he can elect people onto the board.
You need at least 200 shares, by the way.
Yeah. Right? But
they've got nice biltong and wine that they serve there.
Exactly. Yeah, which costs a little bit more than 8 rand. Right? And the board of the SARB is a really good board. It's a fiduciary board. They're there to see that I don't steal. They're there to see that Lesecha doesn't give the printing contract to his cousin. It's a fiduciary board, but it plays no role in monetary policy. It plays no role in interest rate setting. It plays no role in regulation of the financial sector. The board can't say, give that oak a banking license. Don't give that oak. The board can't do that. Right? Those powers are protected in law. So my personal view is it'll make no sense to nationalize the bank. It'll make no difference if you nationalize the bank. It's a complete red herring. There are, however, two other issues. The first is, if the government were to nationalize the bank, would they have to compensate the shareholders for a value or some part of the value of the bank? Now, there will be some lawyers, very smart lawyers, maybe not in South African courts, who will argue that yes, the shareholders must be given some part of the compensation.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair.
Now, what's the value of the central bank? There's a contradiction here, because on the one hand, the law says that the reserves of the country, the foreign exchange reserves of the country, belong to the treasury.
Yeah. And that's approximately $60 billion.
$60 billion.
Yeah.
But it's on the SARB's balance sheet.
Yeah.
Right? So if they were to nationalize the bank and they were to pay out, even if it's 5% of the $60 billion,
That's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money. Right? So from that point of view, it'll make no sense to nationalize it. And again, there'll be no change in the governance, no change in the game. The last issue is what I am concerned about, and I do think is important, is the issue of the independence of the central bank. The ability of a central bank to set monetary policy without political interference. Now that is enshrined in the Constitution. If ever somebody were to change that, I think it would be very negative. But I don't think anyone has seriously suggested that it be changed or has got the political power to be able to change it. Certainly not anymore. So that gives me a lot of comfort, and that allows me to sleep at night.
Okay, let's go back to how the money process works. And again, and you were a member of a monetary policy committee.
Sure.
But essentially what it comes down to, the central bank creates money out of thin air, passes it onto the banking system. The banking system makes it more through the credit system, so the pool of money outside. And we've got various definitions. We call M0 and M1 and M2, and economists look at that. That's very important because we quite often try to find a link between the pool of money in the economy and inflation out there. And of course, there is a very, very important link between the two. It's easy to understand. If there's a lot of something, then the value of that thing comes down. And if there's less of that thing, then the value of that thing stabilizes or goes up. So if there's a lot of money and too much money, then the value goes down, and that means inflation. And there's, by the way, two definitions for inflation. Prices keep on going up, that's one, or the value of money keeps on going down. And that's what the Constitution actually refers to mostly. But your guys, the Monetary Policy Committee members, your job is to decide on the price of money, on interest rates. So if there's too much inflation, you increase in interest rates, making money more expensive, people borrowing less money, less demand in the economy, lower inflation, and opposite. I want to understand this process at the Monetary Policy Committee. Now, I've got this idea, a couple of guys, 5 or 7 currently sitting at the Monetary Policy Committee.
6 at the moment, actually.
6, but there can be as many as 7, I think.
Yeah.
With the governor, of course, he's got a casting vote, sitting around there, and I guess you get a lot of graphs about inflation, expectations, blah, 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 and you debate amongst one another, and then you say, okay, I say 50 bips up, you say 50 bips down, and whatever. How does it work? Give us a bit of an insight.
Sure. The process has evolved and changed slightly since I joined the SARB in 2013, 2012, 2013. But in the main, there are 3 parts of the meeting. Right? The first part of the meeting is where the Monetary Policy Committee receives presentations from the departments in the SARB. So the research department will do a presentation on the state of the economy. The markets department will do a presentation on how we see markets, right? What's happening in financial markets, globally and domestically. We would often receive a presentation on the public finances. Sometimes, occasionally, we will receive a presentation on what's happening in the SADC economy or in the SACU economy, right? Not often, but sometimes we would. So we would get a whole day of presentations by the research department, the financial markets department, sometimes the financial stability department, all the major departments in the SARB will provide presentations. And we discuss that, engage with them, ask questions, criticize each other, criticize their presentations, or sometimes ask, can you go and do some more work for us on labor market issues for the next meeting? Or can you go and do some work? We think that El Nino might be coming back. What impact will that have on food prices? Can you go and do some work for the next meeting? That's part one. The 6 or 7 MPC members in that session is joined by about 40 or 50 people from the bank, right? The key presenters plus all the heads of departments from those core departments. The second session is the forecast session, right? Where only the members of the MPC and the modeling team, right? So the modeling team is about 8 or 10, and the modeling team presents the forecast. It's a very detailed forecast. Modeling has gotten better and better in the last 30 years. We have several models. We have what's called a quarterly projection model, which has become the main model that says how the economy is going to evolve over the next typically 10 quarters. We then have a core model, not to be confused with core inflation, a core model which says how the economy is going to evolve over the next 3 to 5 years, for example. We have a RIMA model that forecasts inflation. It's a fairly short term monthly data model. So the forecast department present all of these forecasts. It's quite a long session, typically 4, 5, 6 hours, and we will debate and engage on those models. When that process is finished, the next morning, the 6 members of the MPC sit alone. And we go through from the most junior to the most senior MPC member, saying what our view on the economy and inflation is, and what stance we'd prefer, not a vote, what stance we'd prefer. I see the 2 major issues are the strength of the dollar, the Fed, oil prices, food prices, whatever, right? I think these are the issues that are concerning me. I think we should hike by 25 basis points, for example, right? And we go through from the most junior member of the MPC to the most senior member. So this is not
a voting process, it's sort of a suggestion.
Exactly, it's a discussion, right? And the governor does his last, so he will say what he thinks. So let's assume that it's a 4-2 split, right? 4 people have voted for a 25 basis point hike and 2 people have voted for a whole.
But vote is not the right word, it's more.
Preferred, right? Often we will carry on discussing, and sometimes somebody says, you know what, I know I said I prefer a 25 basis point hike, but I'm fine for no change, right? Or, you know, actually somebody who says, I said I prefer no change, but having heard the arguments, I'm now supporting a 25 basis point hike.
Oh, okay.
And that happens often. And the governor would, at the end, go around and say, okay, you know, what's your stance? Right? What's your stance? And if there's a split vote, the governor gets the casting vote. If not, then that is the decision, right? Then we have decided that we're going to hike interest rates by 25 basis points. 4 people preferred a 25 basis point hike, 2 people preferred no change, for example. Typically, somebody, either the head of the research department or one of the advisors of to the governor, David Folks now, would have drafted what we would call a vanilla MPC statement, right? And then after we've all decided on what the stance is, he will go away. Brian Kahn used to do it when I first joined. Chris Lowald then, I think now David does it. We'll give them about an hour and they will take the vanilla statement and they will weave the stance into the statement. We'd meet again after lunch and we would go through that statement line by line, word by word, right? And we would typically take 3 or 4 hours to do that. Literally every sentence. The global economy has been buffeted by, you know, the war in Ukraine and rising grain prices. Is everybody comfortable with that sentence? Anyone want to suggest a rewording? Every sentence, right? And when we're done, that's probably the end of Wednesday. Thursday is the press conference.
Okay, but the idea obviously is the reason why I go through this whole process and the statement itself is because you are aiming for that 4.5%, basically, because we've got an inflation target range, a band of 3 to 6%. So you want to aim for that 4.5%. But my question now is that we all understand that, but the governor has been saying recently, and there's a lot of talk about lowering that. Now, personally, I think it's wrong to have a band, because if you have a band, the top one becomes the target.
Yeah.
That's one. The second one, it is too high, because if 4.5% is higher than our main trading partners, I know the government suggested 3%, so if that's a target, you can go around 3%.
Yeah.
But I would rather go for a 2%. What are your views?
So two things I agree with you. The first is that the band does have the psychological problem where 5.99% is within target.
Yeah.
Right? But 3.1 is also within target. So if I'm an economic actor, I don't know where the SARB is targeting, right? If I'm an economic actor, what view do I take about future inflation if I'm not sure what the SARB is exactly targeting? Is it 3.1 or 5.99, right? It creates a degree of uncertainty. So that's the first problem with the band. The second problem with the band is that, how do you tell the public? Because inflation targeting works partly with public perception about inflation and where inflation is going to. So we do agree that a midpoint is better, right? But the inflation target was set in 2000. It was set as a band of 3 to 6. In 2017, the governor explicitly said, we have a band of 3 to 6, but we are targeting 4.5, right? And that was a really good thing that he did. It created clarity in people's minds about what the central bank is targeting. It also took doubt in people's minds. Oh, Kuben prefers 5.99 and Rashad prefers 3.1, right? As an MPC, everybody is focused on one number and one number only 4.5. Right? And I think that we have brought inflation expectations down from the 5.99 range towards the 4.5. Maybe it's not exactly at 4.5, but most economic actors think that inflation is now going to be closer to 4 to 5 rather than 6. Right? Because if you're skating along at 5.99, every time you hit with the shock, you're above target. Right? At 4.5, you still give yourself some room. The third question, should we move towards a lower target? My view is yes, we should move towards a lower target. Whether it's 2 or 3, we can debate. But the question is over what time horizon you do it and what are the conditions that will allow you to do it. If you do it at the wrong time, under the wrong conditions, you will need very tight monetary policy to get there. Right? And the question is whether you want very tight monetary policy again for another 2 or 3 years. There might be some really good gains, but given that we've had almost no growth for 14 years, 1% GDP growth for 14 years, is this the right time to say, well, for 3 more years I want tight monetary policy? That's a genuine debate, and I think as a society we must debate that. What are the economic reforms that will help get you there with what a lower sacrifice ratio? So let's assume you've got efficient SOEs. What I mean by that is Eskom's price doesn't go up by 8 or 15% a year, it goes up by 4% a year.
The so-called administrative
Exactly.
prices. Or
the water utilities are functioning efficiently. Municipalities, I see there's wage negotiations in the municipalities at the moment, and Salga's position is a 3.7% increase, and the unions are demanding 8%. Let's assume they settle on 3.7, hypothetically. Right? They won't, but let's assume they do. It probably means that my municipal tariffs will only go up by 4% in the next year. That's really good if I'm a business person. But if my municipal tariffs are going up by 7%, how does the central bank hit a 3% target when Eskom's electricity prices are going up by 15, water tariffs are going up by 12, municipal tariffs or taxes are going up by 7 or 8? It becomes really hard to hit an inflation target of 2 to 3 under those circumstances. The public sector wage negotiations makes an impact. The fiscal stance, the size of the deficit, makes an impact on that equation. So I do believe that we should move towards a lower inflation target. I do, however, believe that there are certain economic things that we must fix first if we want to get to a sustainably lower target at a lower sacrifice cost.
We're really running out of time. This is just amazing, and I can keep on talking forever about this, but there are two important points I still want to touch on, and then of course I allow for some questions here. And I just want to make this comment here is that you, by the way, we're the practicing economists in the private sector, and we all got a label for each one of these monetary policy committee meetings, and you are known as a dove. You are known as one of the guys that want to keep on cutting interest rates all the time. Listening to you, I can understand why. Because of the issues that you've mentioned, that the macroeconomic environment is not competitive enough to really start reducing inflation targets now, or substantially so. But my question, and this is more of a direct question, so we know where we are at the moment. I think chances are quite good at the next monetary policy committee meeting in 2 months' time, that the Reserve Bank will be in a position, depending what happens on a number of things, but they will be in a position to cut rates. So I think they're going to cut rates again in 2 months after that. So I think at least the 50 bips can be expected this year, and next year perhaps another 50 or even 75 bips. Just don't make spread. Are you sort of more or less in agreement? Are we in a falling interest rate environment? Would you say the next meeting will be see a rate cut?
Yeah, so I agree with that broadly, in the sense that monetary policy has been restrictive. In other words, real interest rates are relatively high, and that was needed to bring down inflation. And the central bank has said that when we're comfortable and confident that inflation is, we're comfortable that in the other thing I didn't mention earlier, interest rates act in a 6 to 18 month time horizon.
Long time.
If I cut interest rates today, there's absolutely no impact on October, November, December. It has an impact on February, March, April, that range, right?
Lag, we call it a lag.
Exactly. If I am super confident, and different people in the EFPC may have different degrees of confidence, if I am super confident that inflation is going to be at or close to our inflation target in that 6 to 18 month horizon, I think that there's room to cut. Right? The QPM forecast suggests that we're going to be at 4.5 by the fourth quarter of this year, and that we are largely going to be close to target in that window of 6 to 18 months, that 12-month window. Right? Because of that, I do think that you'd have to ease monetary policy. Right? At the moment, monetary policy is restrictive. There is room to ease monetary policy. The quarterly projection model has built in, it's called an endogenous interest rate path. Fancy term, sorry. But what it essentially says that if the model were the human being asked to make the decisions, then the model would cut by about 100 basis points over the course of the next 4 quarters. That's what the model says.
Yeah.
Right? And the staff feed that model. So that's the view of the model. The model says we should cut, probably starting in the fourth quarter of this year, or in the third quarter of this year, and we should probably cut around 100 basis points over a period of 4 quarters. Now, some people in the market think we should cut by 125. The model thinks 100. The FRA curves, forward rate agreement curves, so what the interest rate market is telling us, the guys who buy and sell interest rate products, is saying also about 100 basis points over the next year. Right? So I think all else being equal, that's what's likely to happen. Right? No major shocks from abroad, no major shocks from domestically. That's what's likely to happen.
All right. So rate cut, pretty much in line with the views of efficient as well. So I agree broadly, and I think most economists agree out there that there certainly is room for a rate cut, depending, like you said, depending on possible external shocks or factors as well. Now I want to get to some fun stuff. And we've been talking about the evolution of money and how money works and how central banks work and how they interact with the banks and why it's important. And maybe an important topic to discuss one day is the central bank's relationship to the commercial banks and how the central bank manages the commercial banks and makes sure that they remain healthy and they don't fall over, because that can have a run on a bank will be hugely damaging to any economy. So that's the responsibility of the Reserve Bank as well. But we don't have time for that now. So what I want to talk about, it's about the future of money. So where's money going to now? So the most recent form of money is electronic money. It's fiat electronic money, where central banks can create money out of nothing, out of thin air. They manage it by increasing interest rates depending what happens to inflation. So that is sort of the gauge that they use to determine whether they've created enough or too little money in the economy. So inflation is the thing that tells you you're creating too much or too little money in the economy. But what about something else? There's this new kind of money. It's called Bitcoin. It's based on a blockchain technology. There are limitations. It's not the same as the IOUs that the goldsmiths issue. It's different. It's not the same as the private money that was issued to the banks previously, because there's a built-in limitation on how much Bitcoin can be created. I'm only using Bitcoin as an example. There are many other private sector digital currencies as well. And now we have central banks that are starting to issue central bank digital currencies as well. Essentially what happens, if you issue a central bank digital currency and you use the central bank digital currency, and there are many pros and cons here, but if you use that, and I use the central bank digital currency, basically what I've done, I've created for myself an account at the central bank as an individual, and that's not allowed. Not in this current system that we have. So just your broad view about the new evolution of money, private sector money, things like Bitcoin, and maybe central bank digital currency going forward.
Sure. And that's probably an area where you and I may begin to disagree.
Yeah.
We've agreed on most of the things up front so far. I like the technology behind blockchain. I like the technology. I think it's got some lessons and use cases for the world. Blockchain, or what's called distributed ledger, is essentially the equivalent of, I've got a bank account at X bank. If I make a change to my bank account, they change it there. They might have a copy of the somewhere else, but they literally change it there. But actually, theoretically, I can hack that. Right? They spend hundreds and hundreds of millions trying to prevent people from doing it, billions trying to prevent people from doing it, but it's a single ledger. In a distributed ledger, I can have 7 different computers in 7 different parts of the world with an exact copy of the ledger. Right? It's a distributed ledger. And I need a crypto code, a key, to be able to amend all 7 copies of the ledger. It's safer, it's much harder to crack, it's much harder to hack, it's more resilient. If a bomb hits one, there's 6 other copies. Right? So I do think that there are some things, real use cases in the world for distributed ledger. I'll give you 2 examples. Let's assume that the deeds office was on a distributed ledger. Right? You can eliminate corruption in the deeds office.
You can?
By having it on a distributed ledger. The Home Affairs National Identification System, you can significantly reduce corruption and cyber risk and systemic risk if you were to put something like that on a distributed ledger. So, but crypto and cryptocurrency is a different matter. Right?
Can I just interrupt you? So we have to we have to understand we've got the platform, the technology, distributed ledger called the blockchain.
Yes.
And then on top of that you can put all sort of things.
You can put anything on there.
Including money.
You can, yes.
Going back to Bitcoin.
Yeah. So here is a privately issued currency. Right? Now, on the one hand, I don't have a problem with people having their own store of wealth. Right? I'll give you an example. In South Africa, almost half the households have cattle as their store of wealth. Right? I can buy cattle, I can sell cattle, I can trade with cattle. Right? If I want to marry somebody, I take 11 cows. Right? The central bank doesn't regulate the cows. The central bank doesn't regulate the size of the cow, the rate at which Dawie's cows reproduce. We don't regulate any of that stuff. If you want to keep your wealth in cattle, it's your business. If you want to keep your wealth in Bitcoin, it's your business. Right? If you want to own an expensive painting, and you can trade with that. If I own a painting worth R1 million, and actually I want to buy my neighbor's Ferrari, he says, give me the painting. I can do that today. There's nothing illegal. The central bank can't stop you. Right? I do, however, have a problem with privately issued money, whether it's digital or not. And that's where I do believe that this is largely a pyramid scheme. right? That Bitcoin, it's been going for 12 years. We found no real use cases yet, other than the extortion market, the illegal fentanyl market in the US. There's no real use cases that have come out. 12 years the stuff has been going, right? And it's gone up and up and up. It's done incredibly well, but it's backed by nothing. It's neither is it backed by a central bank, proper governance, a government, nothing. Right? Now some people, what would call libertarians, of the view that actually this is lekker.
It's like me.
Right? This is really lekker, right? Finally we can take control away from governments. But the world has had privately issued currencies. And it wasn't a pretty place for the global economy. It was the result of significant boom-bust cycles and significant losses of value and wealth. Right? And I don't see anything that's different today from Bitcoin as Nedbank issuing their own money in 1918. Right? Now, I do believe that the value of these cryptos might go up another 10 times. It could do that. Right? But I am yet to see a single use case anywhere in the world where people have decided, other than maybe Zimbabwe and Venezuela, right, where people have decided, actually we're going to begin to transact in this. So that's my view on crypto.
All right, okay, now this is the disagreement part, this is the debate part, let's talk about that. Well, first of all, let's see where the value of the rand comes from. The value of the rand comes from, well, one thing, the most important thing, and there's confidence. That's the single most important thing. But there's something else supporting the value of the rand. Remember, it's created out of nothing. Like Bitcoin is created out of nothing, the rand. So there's confidence in the Reserve Bank, and it says the Republic of South Africa. But there's something else, and I, as a South African, am forced to pay my taxes with South African rands. That creates a forced demand for rands. If I want to pay my taxes, I don't want to, but if I must pay my taxes, I must have rands to pay to SARS because they don't accept something else.
They don't accept cattle either.
They don't accept cattle. So that creates a demand for rand. But apart from that, the rand is created out of nothing, exactly the same as Bitcoin. Secondly, Bitcoin, you can't just keep on issuing Bitcoin as you like, for example, and I'm not defending Bitcoin as such, because there's in the algorithm supporting the blockchain technology limits the amount of Bitcoin that can create it. So there are so many Bitcoin and not more. Another point that I want to make.
You've got full confidence in the governance of that algorithm.
Well, let me tell you, if you look at the history of central banks, there are many central banks right across the border in South Africa. So but I certainly do not have any confidence in. So the fact that the central bank is under control of the authorities doesn't guarantee that the currency is a valid or a healthy currency, just by the way. So central banks in itself is no guarantee that currencies. But just a last comment that I want to make about the private sector currencies. In fact, you can use your Bitcoin today to go to, I think, Pick n Pay or Checkers, one of those places.
That's what the advert says.
Yeah, that's what they say. I haven't tried it. I haven't tried it. But part of the reason why it's not used as a transaction money that often is because of the cost involved. It is quite a costly process, and I've got a suspicion as it becomes less expensive, the transaction cost, then it will become more frequently used. What about central bank digital currencies then?
Sure. There are two versions of a central bank digital currency. The one you mentioned earlier, where the central bank creates. So let's assume that we create an app, right? So Dawie downloads an app. It's called Saab Rand, right? Saab Coin. Right? You download an app. I can then use that app as a digital wallet, right? It's at the central bank. It's a Saab created thing. I can transfer 500 Rand into my Saab wallet. I can then go and I can spend money on my wallet, like I would do with an MTN mobile wallet or an OZO wallet, or these days there are many private sector created wallet providers, right? Central bank will create a wallet. So that's one model, right? In that case, you will be having a bank account, or if not a bank account, you will be having a wallet at the central bank.
Yeah.
Right? There are other models that you have. You can have a model where we create Saab coins, and we pass those Saab coins on to the banking sector. And the banking sector can pay people using Saab coins, right? So they can, if you come there for a housing loan, they give you your money in Saab coin, or they can give you the money in, or they can put the money into a wallet, and you can go out and spend that. Right. Can you then transfer from Saab coin back into Rand? Could you do that at a central bank, or could you do that at a commercial bank, right? So what you've effectively created is a closed loop currency. Now we have experimented with this. We've built prototypes of this, right? And maybe that is where the world is going to go, right, in the future. In the future, when there's far less use for cash, you have both a central bank issued digital currency, but you also have transferability between the Rand and that currency. That might happen in the future. I have not yet seen any real use cases for it. Right? So some people say you should have a central bank digital currency because you want to compete with Bitcoin. But people who buy Bitcoin are buying it, in my view, purely for speculative purposes. Right? You can't buy a central bank digital currency for speculative purposes. Certainly you're not going to go up from $7,000 to $60,000 in 10 years. Right? That's not going to happen. Right? And so I'm yet to see the use case. I do, however, believe that in the future, most money is going to be digital. Yeah. And cash will gradually decline as a share, or as a store of wealth and a share of transactions. I mean, let me just give you a sense of the numbers. In South Africa, notes and coins are about 2.5% of GDP. Right? That's the same as Germany. It's the same as France. It's slightly lower than the US. But China, it's 1%. China went from 5% notes and coins in circulation to 1% in 5-7 years. In Sweden, it's 1%. Right? Brazil went from 8% to about 4-5% in the last 5 years. Right? India went from 16% to 8% in 3 years. Right? Globally, everybody says, but cash is king, I like anonymity, I don't want the taxman to know what my digital transaction is. You go to Mumbai and you try and buy a bunch of tomatoes on the street. You can't use it with cash anymore. They'll say, here's a QR code, scan it please. Right? So I do believe that the future of payments are going to be instant, largely free, and irrevocable. In the future, most payments are going to be free, instant, and irrevocable. Free, there will be almost zero transaction cost. Instant, the money will be in your account immediately, not overnight. Right? And irrevocable is I can't reverse it, which final. Introduces a whole degree of risk. So if I've put in 1,000 and not 1 or not 20 to buy the bunch of tomatoes, it's gone. Right? Again, that introduces a different degree of risk, but I believe that that's where the future of money is going.
I totally agree with that, and it sounds a little bit like Bitcoin, let's be honest. Except perhaps for the transaction cost part. Listen, this was absolutely amazing. I think what is happening is that if you look at the world of money, the world of banking, what is happening, this is just, it has been changing for thousands of years, literally.
Exactly.
The nature of money has been changing. It will continue to change, and it will continue to evolve, and every time it changes, I believe, it leads to this new economic activity that's happening around that, and it's all for the betterment of humankind. It's all for the good for the economy, and as money evolves, which is a lubricant in the economy, I think economic growth will over time also be supported by whatever form the new money is going to take. And I believe the blockchain technology is certainly going to play a part in that. But let's see how it pans out. Maybe we can talk in 10 years' time again. So I think we should take a couple of questions. Roodt?
Yeah, so we just stand here, Dawie.
Okay.
We had some noise issues. But yeah, there's no questions actually is there questions from the audience?
Yeah, I've got some questions.
I'm wondering about a monetary policy and, playing, especially with the repo rates, to kind of enforce, growth in the economy. There's something that we as financial advisors see on a daily basis, and that's the NCA.
Sorry, what?
So the National Credit...
Oh, okay, yes, NCA.
Is that there's a strange thing happening where in the last 10 to 8 years, the credit card has gone from 11 to 22%. And that, especially when you come to companies, there's now invoice discounting, where guys are asking 3.45 per month. Is that
interest rates?
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So what I feel out of that perspective, how relevant is the repo rate, and how much power does the central bank have, where the private banks actually have much more power to kind of push more spending and so forth, with what their limit is that they can ask on credit.
Can I just summarize the question here quickly? I think the question is, and that's a valid question because I don't know really what the answer is, that the central bank sets sort of the bottom of interest rates in the economy, but can the private sector ask whatever they want to if they lend out money? You mentioned credit card companies that really nail you with interest rates if you borrow money in credit cards. Is there a limitation on how much banks and financial institutions can charge?
That's a really good question, because we do monetary policy forums in the townships. In the townships, people tell you, look around you, you think anybody here borrows money close to 8.25. Your repo rate is irrelevant to us, right? We're borrowing at 25. We're borrowing at 28. Your repo rate's got no effect in this community, right? It's a genuinely good question. There are two different aspects here. The first is, does the floor in interest rates affect the broad supply and demand for credit in the economy? And the answer generally is yes, because it's not just me borrowing for my credit card. I may borrow for a mortgage loan, and that does go down or up depending on the interest rate, right? Most people have floating interest rate bonds. So let's assume that there's no new borrowing, and I've got a mortgage loan, and the repo rate goes up. I've got less money to spend. So I buy fewer Coca-Colas or fewer liters of petrol, which puts pressure on those prices, right? So it is true that the floor interest rate does affect supply and demand conditions. The second thing is, does the banking system is the banking system competitive enough? So is the spread between what the bank borrows at and what the bank lends at small enough, or is it very large? Right? And I do agree that in South Africa, the banking system is not as competitive as in other countries.
Totally.
They have a relatively large margin there. Right? But the other thing is that what we're talking about here, what the SARB sets, is what's called the overnight interest rate. Right? And it's a risk-free interest rate, the overnight interest rate. If I'm lending money to you at 6% for 6 months, or for 12 months, or for 10 years, there's a different interest rate. Right? If I'm lending money to you on an unsecured basis relative to whether it's secured, so you've got collateral or security, it's a different interest rate. Right? And those are largely determined by the market. So short answer, yes, I believe the repo rate does affect overall supply and demand for credit and demand. But yes, the repo rate plays no major role in interest rates all along that maturity curve for both secured and unsecured interest rates.
I'm just thinking about it the other way, especially in times when we can't, play with each other. Is it not more beneficial for monetary policy to go and play with the NCA? So to say, this is the limit, I want to reduce the limit of what, the credit
Can I just summarize what you just said? Basically what you're saying is that shouldn't there be some other channels, so limit how much money people can borrow, for example, instead of changing the price, change the quantity that people are allowed to borrow?
Again, a good debate, and it's a debate I've been involved in from my days at the Treasury, right? We had the unsecured lenders, the micro lenders, the mashonisas. Should we cap the interest rate? So there is a cap, right? For amounts over, 10,000 Rand, I think there is a cap, right? Is the cap a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not 100% sure in my mind. Let me argue both ways. The cap is a good thing because it prevents exploitation of people. People get incredibly high interest rates. They get into a debt spiral. They can't get out. So you should have a cap, right? The market doesn't function optimally because of what's called an information asymmetry between what the individual knows and what the lender knows. And to solve that problem, interest rates have to be very high. So I could argue that there should be a cap. But I could also argue that if there is a cap, there's a lot of people in the economy who wouldn't get credit at all. So if you control prices and not quantities, the a fall in the price will result in a rise in the quantity. A rise in the price will result in a fall in the quantity. So it might suit me fine. I live in a nice house in a leafy suburb. But if somebody lives in a township and has got no collateral and has to borrow the money, and they can't get the money because at that interest rate the lender won't lend to them, then that person is lost out.
Yeah.
And so it's a very delicate trade-off between trying to cap and control interest rates at the top. Some days of the week I think it's a good thing. Some days of the week I think it's a bad thing.
Very good question, Jaco. Any other questions from the audience? Nothing? Online, it means there's no questions. Just a question from my side, I think that Dawie will argue that you only need economists serving as MPC members. seven economists is all that's necessary. But if you have a look at some of the largest central banks in the world, and you look at Jay Powell of the US, you look at Christine Lagarde, ECB, and you look at Kuroda in Japan, they're not economists by specialization, they're rather lawyers. Is today's world of such a nature that you can afford to have individuals of diverse backgrounds as MPC members, or do you only need economists? Does the models more regulate what the decisions are then based on?
Can I check, before you answer that, I think that's a very good question. I would argue that you do not need economists on the Monetary Policy Committee, because economists, as you study to become an economist, you've got set in certain ways, you've got a certain ideology that you follow, and you're going to follow that ideology come hell or high water, and that's not what we want. We want somebody that's pragmatic. So I would argue for somebody else, not necessarily economist. But you need a good economics background.
Exactly. So let me tell you, I'm not an economist. I pretended I'm an economist for about 30 years, but I'm not an economist. I went to university. I did a degree in maths and computer science. I went to work in IT. I lasted 18 months. I hated it. I then went and did a diploma in public management, and I got a job as an education budget researcher at the Treasury. My maths was good enough to be able to get the job. All I was doing was analyzing budgets on spreadsheets, right? It didn't require economics, it just required a bit of maths. And I fell in love with economics. So I went and I read, and I did a few courses here and there. I don't have a degree in economics. I went overseas, I did an MBA, there was a little bit of economics in there, but there wasn't hard economics. Because of my maths background, I can understand the equations and I can understand the models and the structuring of the models. But I'm not an economist. I've just thoroughly enjoyed economics.
Well, I disagree with you one thing. You are an economist. And in fact, we are all economists. Because we all make decisions about supply and demand. We all make decisions about money. We all always make decisions. And I would argue all decisions are always economic decisions. Always. All decisions. Even a decision of who you want to get married to is an economic decision. So we're all economists.
That's a good point. And then also second question, follow-up question is in terms of artificial intelligence and the progress that we're seeing now, would those be able to one day replace central bank members? Because it's only based on gathering economic data, analyzing that economic data. I think it's more on the prediction side, AI might become a problem. But do you foresee that in the next few years? Or rather, the MPC members will rather start to use as a tool rather than a replacement?
So firstly, I'm hugely excited by AI's ability to raise productivity in the economy. I'm hugely excited about it. I have used AI many times and I continue to use AI. In fact, I did an experiment when I was head of the Financial Stability Department. I did an experiment with the guys. I said, when ChatGPT came out, and you can go and do it now. Let's put in there, what are the major financial stability risks facing South Africa? And it writes a 2-pager. The first time I did it was about 2.5 years ago, just when that would not have passed a first-year economics essay. Right? If I do it now, today, that would be the equivalent of a third year, maybe even an honors student economics. Right? Probably not yet good enough as my head of financial stability, Dr. Nicola Brink at the South, but it's bloody good. I'm pretty sure in 18 months' time it may even be better than that. Right? So I do think that AI is fundamentally going to raise productivity.
Yeah.
and must be used in ways that enhance decision making. There's no doubt about it. I don't think we're yet able to take away the human factor in the human intelligence part to be able to make decisions based on risk as opposed to data. And let me explain what I mean by that. So under normal circumstances, we've got this QPM, the quarterly projection model. It's all very transparent, it's open. You can go and you can see what does the QPM suggest is the interest rate going to be in 3 months' time, 6 months' time. It's all there. Right? That's the collective input of 300 researchers, 45 PhDs, right, that we employ at the South. So it's all there, it's transparent. When you get hit by a crisis like COVID, the computer is unable to be able to make a sound decision. Right? The QPM at the time, when the COVID crisis hit, so the March meeting, the March 2020 meeting, right? There was insufficient data to be able to feed into the computer for it to make a valuable decision. We had no data on what the first quarter GDP number was going to be. We had no idea. Right? We had no idea how deep the recession was going to be. We were watching what's happening in China, Italy, the UK. We were about 4 or 5 weeks behind them, maybe 6 weeks. Right? You needed human beings to be able to say, what we see in China, Italy, the UK, this is going to be an incredibly deep recession. We must cut interest rates and cut it rapidly. Right? So the March QPM, and even we remember we had an emergency meeting in April in 2020, said 100, or maybe 50. We cut by 350 basis points in 8 weeks. The model didn't say it. Right? So I still think that there are times when the model is not going to tell you, it is going to be a little bit flawed, right? Simply because of the way in which models work and the way in which data is accumulated and comes through.
So, maybe a comment from my side. Is it possible to put the economy in one equation, in one formula? Is it possible to put the economy into a computer? And the answer is no.
Exactly.
It is such an amazing, complicated thing out there that we all participate, that we all join it, but we all influence one way or the other. I don't believe it will ever be possible for an economy, for a computer or a computer program to fully represent this thing that we call the economy.
We say it a lot, that a lot of the intangibles are also immeasurable given the technological advancement.
It's too complicated.
I mean, when I started at the Treasury in 95, the economic forecasting model had 12 equations. When I left the Treasury, it had 48. Today, it's got 200. But there are 7 or 8 billion people on the planet. There are hundreds of thousands of firms, all making decisions independently. Right? Models can only approximate reality.
Exactly.
Right? You need an infinitely complex model. And just to go from 12 equations to 48 equations probably took us 10 years. Right? 10 years.
Unbelievable. Any other questions before we conclude? Jaco again.
Just touching now on the rise of AI and the market productivity that we'll have as a tool. With all the discussions coming, especially on the economic side, what are your thoughts on universal basic income? So paying, especially when certain jobs start to get phased out of the economy and so forth, and products are mostly leaning now more to how can I say, the rich instead of the poor. What is
you're opening a huge debate now. You're opening a huge thing now. I wonder if you should go there. So,
But what is your thoughts on that universal basic income? Is there space in the economy to do something like that, and is it positive, negative?
Okay, I'm going to duck the question in the following manner. Whenever there's a new thing that dramatically raises productivity, there's a worry about jobs.
Yeah, always.
Right? There's a worry about jobs. And technological change does create displacement in work. Yeah. But I've not seen evidence that it leads to joblessness in aggregate. Right? So when the steam engine replaced the hand loom, there were thousands of people who worked in looming in the textile industry who lost their jobs. But aggregate employment didn't necessarily fall. You might have an intertemporal fall for some time, but actually there are new industries that come into play. There are new professions that come into play. I mean, I'll give you an example. In Europe, there is a ratio of working people to people who are over 60 or retired people. At the moment, that ratio is 2.5 to 1. So for every 2.5 people of working age, 18 to 60, there's one person above retirement age, or 65, whatever their retirement age is. In my lifetime, that ratio is going to become 1 to 1. There's going to be an equal number of people of working age as to retired. Now let's assume you've got a 5% unemployment rate. You're going to have more people that are old and need care than who work. Right? Now, unless you design a robot to look after those people, you're going to need frail care help, support, right? The job that's really hard to robotize or automate.
To give the machine.
So I do agree. I think that technological change will create huge disruption. I'm not convinced that it would lead to mass unemployment.
Yeah, agree with that.
Okay, excellent stuff.
That's a very good answer.
Yeah. Thank you, Jan.
Yep.
Do you see banks giving individual interest rates for their client based on certain benefits?
To do that already. Do we foresee banks?
Banks determine individual interest rates for their clients based on certain benefits.
Yeah, and they do that already.
Banks do that already, but let me tell you how it's changing. Today, there's a certain cell phone company that owns a micro lender. That cell phone company asks you for permission to give them the data on your phone. Based on the data on your phone, the cell phone company sets the interest rate for this micro loan. So I'll give you 3 stories. The first, if you wake up before 6 a.m., you've got a 42% higher probability of repaying the loan than if you wake up after 6 a.m. Sorry, if you wake up before 6 a.m. Secondly, if you've got first names and surnames in your contact list, there's a 37% higher probability that you're going to repay the loan.
First name.
First names and surnames in your contact list, you have a higher probability of repaying the loan than if you only got first names. Right? From their phone, they can tell how well you've slept. They can tell how loudly you talk. Right? They can tell where you've been, how fast you drive. Right? All of that, 10,000 data points from your phone are now being used to set your credit score.
Be careful, because there's a data that I read about people consuming frozen yogurt in the United States. And the consumption of frozen yogurt has been coming down, and the divorce rate has been coming down as well, just by the way. So far causality there.
So you're absolutely right. Correlation doesn't imply causation.
Not necessarily.
Right?
Not
and I'm
necessarily.
sure that, but these, using big data, these things are learning. And they're going to make mistakes and they're going to get it right. Right? If a complete stranger walks in off the street, I don't know the guy. I don't know what his background is. And I may ask him for 3 months bank statements. I may ask him for proof of address. I may look at him if he's neatly dressed or not. As a banker, it's my money, it's my risk. I'm taking the risk here, right? Now I've got 10,000 data points from his phone. I know how much of time he spends playing games on his phone. I know what time he wakes up. I know his consumption patterns, right? And so it is already happening that people are using data to be able to risk weight people. I mean, I recently I was looking for a job for 6 months. My wife helped me draw up my CV. I must have had coffee with about 20 different companies. Nobody asked me for my CV. Nobody. Not once.
Yeah, you don't need that anymore.
You don't need it.
Change it.
Data's all there.
Data's
I
all
think
there.
after today, we're all going to get rid of our smartphones and buy Nokia 3310s. Anything else online? Okay. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. This is lovely.
And it's a privilege. I think for us as advisors and investors, it's important to know also what the rate environment is going to do going forward. We invest our clients' money in bonds, equities, and money markets, and this definitely guided us in the right direction, with the added benefit of knowing the history of money and also getting a little bit of debate on cryptos, which I think we'll take forth afterwards. Those leaflets that are on your tables, just leave them, please. Don't take them with you. So if you want to win the $500. And thank you for everybody joining us online. We'll see you next month again.
Thanks, Kuben.